Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. Is practice real to the practitioner? Perhaps. We'll discuss that. If practice were more real to the practitioner, would they be more inclined to learn in experience and for future experience? We'll consider that. Even as you listen to this, ask yourself, is there a practice that's real to you? Are several practices real to you? Can they be more real and therefore more beneficial? Can they be made better? By whom? All of this and more is contained in this conversation. A note, however, I discovered to my chagrin upon editing this conversation that there was some kind of strange background noise, sounded like someone breathing, possibly me, that makes some of the words of Peter and mine a little difficult to hear. Now, we do have the help of a fine young man, Anthony, who's doing final edits, and hopefully Anthony will be able to use his magic kit to take out even more of those rough edges. The content is so important in this one. Even though it's a little difficult to listen to, it's worth it. See if I'm right. When we left off in our last conversation, Peter, we were back at our fundamental way of thinking of practice, that definition, and you were inserting a modification using the word increasing. It gives me the feeling right now that the increaser in chief of doing this for one's practice is that practitioner herself. That if there's going to be ability to reach higher levels of results, if there's going to be more growth as a result of those efforts, we're thinking about a learner who has a different sense of practice, don't you think, than the person who doesn't have the sense of practice. So my question to start our conversation is,
okay.
While it's real to us, because we've talked about it and written about it, is practice real to the individual?
Technically, we don't know. When I say we don't know, I mean we don't know what a practitioner is thinking about as he or she goes about their practice. We don't know how much reflection they're doing on the quality of their practice of what they're doing. My assumption is that most people become quite aware of aspects of their practice that they feel they need to work on, or that they're especially proud of, or that they're having a difficult time over, or that maybe they need to downplay and give less attention to, or make it less a part of their practice. They may not have a full awareness of the whole practice, and in fact, even someone who is acutely aware of their practice probably doesn't have a full awareness of their whole practice. But remember, last week when I was saying the increasingly conscious ability, I wanted to put that word increasingly in because I wanted to call attention to the fact that people do get better, or they can get better and better at the process of reflecting on their practice and working on improving it. I suppose you could say, by the way, what are the drivers, what are the motivators that lead an individual to be conscious of their practice? And maybe the fact that it's their principal livelihood in terms of financial earnings is a major driver. Maybe the fact that they've got a lot of money invested in it is a major driver. Maybe the fact that they're down the road there is some promise of considerable glory and compliments from other individuals, fame as well as fortune, if they work on this practice. Or maybe it's just the intrinsic pleasure of sanding the bottom of a boat they're building or something. I guess we don't sand bottoms of boats anymore. They're all plastic. But in my day,
Yeah, I remember those.
we used to spend a lot of elbow grease on wooden bottoms. Anyway, so I think we can make some assumptions about how conscious people are of their practice. And what we hope is that they're becoming increasingly conscious,
Yes.
not just increasingly able to practice, but increasingly conscious of these challenges that their practice contains. Beyond that, question then becomes, well, what about learners who already from time to time are conscious of various aspects of their practice and of what they're learning from it and what they need to be doing with it? What can someone like you or me consciously do, deliberately do, to stimulate their learning and stimulate their awareness of their practice? Well, these podcasts are one thing, I guess. I hope.
Yep.
And maybe driving along in a car or something, somebody is having some memories of their practice as they listen to us talk and having some thoughts about they need to be doing with respect to their practice. And hopefully some of that is going on. Books they might read, articles they might see are all stimulators, potential stimulators. And then there are events within the learning group. We might call them exercises. Some cynic might call them fun and games. But both you and I have been fairly prolific, I think, in inventing experiences, inventing exercises that help to increase the consciousness that individuals might have of their learning, of the nature of their learning and the nature of their practice within which their learning is occurring. I'm making the assumption that a lot of practitioners are working in group situations. I've had some fun over the years inventing exercises that made group phenomena more real, intended to make group phenomena more real. Amazing that people can sit in meetings or other ways of in a work group and have all kinds of intense feelings about it, but never quite take the next step to become aware of the phenomenon of the group qua group and what it signifies in the way it's behaving. But when they're doing their practicing, whatever it is, whether they're a mature practitioner or just a beginner, they're certainly going to be aware of the impact of group phenomena on their ability to practice. And so I've had some fun over the years inventing exercises that made group phenomena more real and gave us as a learning group an opportunity to talk to each other about what one exercise or another has taught us about group behavior. One I've had a particular amount of fun with over the years. One time the learning group was meeting on a Saturday afternoon in a kind of a rec room environment where there was a pool table off to one side out of the way, and over in another corner there was some couches and chairs and a glass top coffee table. I'd been concerned for a number of months or even years that we spend too much time talking about groups and all the talking they do to each other, and we don't spend enough time reflecting on the feelings that groups have for each other and the physical contacts members of groups have with each other, their perceptions of how each other dress and walk and talk and eat and so forth. And there are many groups, I don't know, in my experience, principally men, maybe women do this too, where men will bing each other on the shoulder or give each other high fives. Or, you see a couple of people doing a high five, or you see a group where everybody's high fiving everybody else, like in that Grand Slam home run that was hit by the Washington Nationals the other night to win the 5-game playoff of the National League. where everybody is high-fiving everybody else. That's very physical behavior, and it does a lot to establish the bonds of the group and the reality of the group. What if some individual refused to high-five people and sat off in a corner and sulked while everybody was high-fiving each other? What would happen to such a person in the ensuing life of that group? So I saw this glass top coffee table, and I saw this pool table with this cue ball rolling around on it, and I got the idea of what if we picked up the glass top coffee table and we put the cue ball on the glass top coffee table, and we put 5 people or 6 people around the periphery of the table, picked it up, and by moving the table one way or another, up or down and so forth, the ball rolls around. And what if you had a deliberate target, like a circle drawn by a magic marker, and the task was to stop the ball in the circle, inside the circle drawn by the magic marker? What kind of an experience would that be? And I actually proposed it to the group, and they bought it, and we tried it, and we had, for the next hour or so, we had just a lot of fun experimenting with different configurations of people and different kinds of tasks. At one point, we took the magic marker and we drew a path, one circle to another circle, and
Wow.
and they had to follow this path around the table. And so, which group of 6 individuals could do that the fastest and the most efficiently, and so forth. And we experimented with giving a group planning time or no planning time. We gave them the once we tried doing everybody blindfolded except one person who became obviously the leader, and and the leader had to communicate to the group members what the ball was doing and how close it was getting to stopping on the inside the circle drawn by the magic marker. And I've since learned that use that exercise in many different contexts. I actually built at one point. I built a table with its own surface. I remember staying down in my basement and sanding one night a big piece of plywood to get it as smooth as possible.
You were devoted to that exercise.
And I had visions of its effectiveness,
Yeah.
and I had visions of writing it up and of getting it published and all that, which I never did.
Oh,
This story I'm telling you is the first public display of this exercise.
wow.
That's something about me that I've never understood very well in my practice. But anyway, lots of other occasions to help make group phenomena more real for practitioners. I think I said last week that I'm particularly concerned in the way we talk about practice to our students or our other members of groups that we might be leading. I'm particularly concerned that we don't talk enough about how thoroughly interactive practice is. That you are embedded in networks of people. You're not, for the most part, lone wolf operators in your practice. Even your golf game, while you're very conscious of your own learning in the golf game, I'll bet you're playing with groups more than you're playing by yourself.
I am.
Is that true?
And each time I'm observing the other golfers and they're observing me, and our custom in my little course is that we provide very friendly advice or none at all. Very few negatives, which keeps the game light, but I feel a lot of growth. I prefer to play with whoever is there who'd be willing to let me play along, or I invite people to play. And there's 2 things about the table story. First, I suspect that when you as the professor were engaging the students in an exercise, they weren't stopping at the end and turning to you and say, all right, tell us what this meant. explain all of this to us. What theories relate to this? My hunch is that it was co-inquiry at its best. You were asking them, what do you pick up on this? What are you seeing? And here's some things I'm seeing. And your excitement, even you may have done that exercise with several other groups, was, hey, you guys have come up with a new angle on this. Or, I never saw a group drop the ball so many times and yet beat the clock. You know what I mean? And so that kind of interplay, you're teaching them how you valued their learning in action. That was your big lesson. If you acted like that didn't matter to you, and this was just, hey, let's kill 25 minutes here, it would have been a bust. But so I think we're talking now to people who teach right now or train right now, and we're saying, hey, the more you can show enthusiasm for learning in action, the more likely they are to bring that out into their own practice and keep doing it, because you've certified that they've come up with some pretty good insights on the fly. Thoughts?
Absolutely. You only in what you just said. I think you used the word co-inquiry only once.
Yeah.
But I simply would like to flag that word. Co-inquiry to me, that the person who's leading the session and who is ostensibly the expert, so to speak, is having learning experiences right alongside the learners, the official learners in a group, and they are mutually enriching each other's learning, and they're all aware that that process is going on. Think about how many classrooms where it never occurs to students sitting there in the classroom that the professor up in front of them is having learning experiences himself or herself. It never occurs to them.
I don't think so. I don't think that's a stereotype.
It doesn't occur to the professor to share the learning that he or she is having. They may go back to the coffee room and share it with a couple of other professorial colleagues, but to actually stop and say to the class, I just had the most wonderful learning experience with you guys, is pretty unusual in my experience. I don't know about you, but
no, I've been a learning junkie for my whole career, and not mine alone. I mean, I've loved learning. Who wouldn't? But I've loved observing others learning, particularly if I've constructed some scenario, call it an exercise or a discussion, where the lights start to come on and you can see the popping of ideas almost on their foreheads. It's a thrill. And I suspect that there are thousands of teachers at every level and trainers who share that addiction in a small way. What's problem, and you and I have talked and even written about, one of the problems is that the system itself, the institution, the configuration of relationships, teacher to learner, sometimes just communicates something very different, which is, I'm going to give you the knowledge. You're going to prove to me that you've received it. Yeah, you prove to me you received it. You know, the famous blue book. I'll give you a grade. Bye. And that's a horrible waste. And nowadays, with the high cost of all education, particularly higher education, that system is sending the wrong message. How might we put a little pin and let out some of that pomposity, Peter, so that people can enjoy teaching and learning the way we do? I mean, you were a dean once. Did you have a pin? Did you ever poke your system a little bit to let out some hot air?
Well, as a matter of fact, I did. I used to talk in my faculty meetings. I used to share a lot about what I was learning as a boy dean. I was the youngest member of my entire faculty of 120 individuals, and I was the dean.
Yeah.
And many of them were as much as 25 years older than I was, and I somehow managed to share with them what I was learning in the process. which encouraged them to share with me what they thought I could do more of or less of, and give me constructive feedback in a supportive way that I might never have gotten had I not brought up my own the learning that was going on in my developing practice as a dean. I wanted to interrupt us in this set of reflections, though, Dave, and remind ourselves, each other, and our listeners, all of what we're saying has a relevance for practice. The question is whether a leader slash facilitator of some kind of learning experience in a group, whether it's a class or not. The question is whether this is brought up, whether it becomes legitimate to talk about the relevance of these experiences and these events for practice on the outside, so to speak.
Yes.
As I think I've said more than once in these podcasts, all of us are going to end up practitioners of something. All of us are going to have one or more practices that we are energetically pursuing, so that everything we're talking about is relevant to the conscious ability to increasingly produce fairly consistently intended consequences across a range of circumstances. And as I think I said last week, and I think I'm going to continue to say as I talk about practice in the coming months and years, we don't emphasize enough that practice is an interactive phenomenon. Practice is a behavioral phenomenon of human beings talking and working with each other. Practice is not a lone individual for the most part. I always remember the student who came up to me after class one time, and this was at one of America's leading business schools, said to me, Professor Vail, all this behavioral stuff you're talking about, I'm not going to have any of these problems when I get out into the world of work. And I said, oh, really? I said, that's interesting. Tell me more. And he said, no, it's seriously. He said, it's going to be just me and a secretary and a terminal. And so I'm not going to have any of these problems of trust and openness and growth and learning and all this stuff. And I said, Andrew, dear Andrew, where have I failed? I don't think I said, but I did express some consternation to him that he had not really thought deeply enough about what was going to be like as wanted to be a financial planner. What his world was going to be like. It never occurred to him that the customers or the clients he was going to have some very tricky behavioral relationships with the men and women who brought their money to him or didn't bring their money to him, and asking him to do something creative with it. And the idea that somebody was sitting in one of my classes saying to himself, I'm not going to have any of these problems when I get out practicing what I intend to practice. I've missed something somewhere as a leader of the learning process.
But here's exactly the point that I think we started on around how is learning real? I mean, how is practice real to the learner? For that, Andrew, at that moment of time, in his mind, that's how he had built his practice so far and how he projected it out to be himself, a terminal, and a secretary, which that was a fantasy right there, given what's changed there. But my point is that Andrew's involved in that course with that in mind. The next person over might have a different title to the practice that she's thinking of, but she is all over this stuff. This really fills in a lot of gaps for her, and the next person somewhere in between. That's a tremendous amount of power that these learners bring to every situation. The practice they carry in the door is as good as they've made it so far, or as badly as they've made it so far. And one of my questions is there, are we advocating people choosing to make their practices better as an intention, as maybe a solution to some of the successes they need in life? You got to practice, make it better. Keep making it better, because it's constantly going to be challenging you to come up with new lessons relate to different people. What do you think about that issue of better?
I'm not sure this is going to be directly responsive to your question, and if not, tell me. But we have not said, among the various conjectures that we have shared about practice, we haven't really said to each other, the practitioner and the practice are not freestanding entities.
Right.
The practitioner and the practice are inextricably woven together into one phenomenon. Every practice has a practitioner. Every practitioner has a practice. Therefore, to talk about better is to talk about that combined phenomenon, not better practice or better practitioner, but better practitioner of practice.
Aha.
And it leads us to a challenge to say what better then means for any given practice. And it's a little hard to say. I don't think I'm able to say abstractly, but I say concretely. If I pick some practice of my own, I can say more concretely what my practice of that I as a practitioner of that practice mean, and what better would mean for me and my practice. In my case, one of the practices that I have most vividly in my mind is racing sailboats.
Mm-hmm.
And in one very simple sense, better means winning more races or finishing higher in the standings more consistently. There are lots of other dimensions of better. Better in certain kinds of wind, better with certain kinds of sails, better with a crew or better without a crew. Better when the stakes are high, better when the stakes are not so high. And you can do the same thing with golf. In a simple way, golf is the size of your handicap. I won't ask you what it is.
No, that's a secret.
but beyond the sheer size of your handicap as a crude measure, better means lots of more specific things. There are many different kinds of shots that you might want to get better at, and there are clubs that you're not the full potential out of them, and there are other uses of yourself as in terms of your resources, the money you're spending or the courses you're playing, where better might mean something quite specific for you. Better, one thing I've taught myself back in the days when I was studying what I called high performing systems intensively, is that high performance is a subjective phenomenon. It's not an objective phenomenon. Winning is only the thing you think winning is, as I think I quoted myself last week in our previous podcast. And no matter how many times that you think that there is an objective measure of better, it always comes down to what individuals think better means. Just in the paper this morning, there was an article about the bitter disappointment of a pitcher for the Dodgers named Clayton Kershaw, who year in and year out has been a superb pitcher during the regular season, but year in and year out he's had trouble in the playoffs. And once again, his ship got sunk in the 10th inning the other night. In the 10th inning, when the grand slam home run was hit, not off him personally, but off his pitching staff
Yeah.
that left the Dodgers out of the playoffs. And it showed him sitting on the bench holding his head in his hands.
I saw that. Yeah, that was quite an image.
But he's going to come up with some definition of that. Well, in fact, the article was about how there are other meanings of better than just winning in the playoffs. So winning is only the thing you think winning is.
And better is only what you think better is.
Yeah.
That, but you know, I think
kind of a mantra with me.
My early years, one of the many catchphrases was, 2 strikes off a match. I never quite figured out how you get 2 strikes off a match. But I'm thinking better, act, see if you can make it better. And then the other strike of the match is, what did I learn by that? So he's got his head down, but my hunch is in and amongst the agonizing thoughts, he's already thinking about how he could reorganize for the next season or for that's what I've witnessed in people who seem to be ever better. From my perspective, is that they want to take some lessons out. Failure, is a way to learn as well as success. So in summarizing, because we are once again burning up the seconds here, we started out thinking, what is the importance of the learner having practice on their own terms by their own definition, so much that it is real, to them, so that as they work out into time and space and come in and work within our training settings, they are using both real and simulated experiences to make that practice work better for them, because that's who they are. They are that practice in that moment in time. Sailor, golfer, teacher, physician. That spirit, and you've written a whole book about spirit, is something we might want to explore in another conversation, because I think it almost comes to that. I'm only going to get 1 strike off the match if I just want to have the activity prove that I've grown better at it. But I want that other strike of the match saying, going forward in similar situations, what am I learning here that I can both use myself and offer as advice to others?
Mm-hmm. I like that.
2 strikes on the match. Growing up in Maine, you learn a lot of those phrases, probably in Minnesota as well.
Yeah. Well, our listeners might reflect on this conversation. There needs to be a larger context within which practice is part of the learning experience. A participant in a learning program, a member of the group, needn't be surprised when you as the discussion leader bring up the subject of practice and its relevance. In order for them not to be surprised, it means that you have to have set some larger context about the importance of practice, and that we're going to be talking about this continually as time goes by. And I think maybe we need to spend some more time on that too, the learning context. I know when I was a dean, I spent a lot of time worrying about how various individual professors who I knew were doing very creative work, how that creative work, what they were doing in their own classrooms, could be carried to other members of the faculty without invading on their own academic freedom. How could I get other members of the faculty to pay attention to what this guy was doing? I had one math professor who was extremely creative in teaching statistics to the statistically challenged, and he had a bunch of techniques that could be easily adapted to other subject matter. And I had the idea that I would interview him about how he thinks of his students and how he thinks of the learning process and where all these creative ideas of his come from. And I would print that up and I would circulate it to the faculty. And I told him about my idea, and he said, "Please don't do that."
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
he didn't want a bright light shone on his practice. And I said, "Well, Tom, I'm sorry to hear you say that because there's an awful lot that other members of our faculty could learn from you, and that's a problem I never did feel that I solved."
I'm afraid it's
As,
still going on in many places, Peter. That does merit another conversation because there's a lot of individual learning that teachers gain in their own specific practice. But if they feel they have to hold that close to their chest, maybe cultural reasons, maybe they're afraid if they give someone else the idea they'll steal it. I don't know, whatever the craziness is, but that has to change. Why? Because those practitioners to be, or those who are already have in their heads some practice that they'd like to make this learning relevant to, are paying for it. They're there. They're staking a good part of their future success on how well that course or the set of courses in that program is going to work with them, for them. And so we academicians don't get the cozy privilege of doing our thing without any interest in what anyone else is doing. Reverend Fearon has spoken. Don't get me started, or do get me started, but let's do it on the next conversation so we don't go past our time limit. Final thoughts on what we talked about today, making learning real.
Those were my final thoughts. Thank you.
That made it easy then. Okay. Well, thank you again, Peter. This has been another one that gets my head spinning, and I get my blood pressure down a little bit after this, and I think we should talk about that larger context in the next conversation. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.